Namaskar and welcome back to Media Scan, your weekend dose of headlines, controversies and perspectives. In this special episode, we will have a conversation with Professor Salvatore Babones, a well-known Australian academic who has shown through detailed research what India has been flagging all this while, that a section of the Western media and their think tanks have a clear-cut anti-India bias. But before I connect to him, what made news? Top leaders put their heads together in the first physical SCO meet since COVID to chart the future roadmap in Samarkand this week. Prime Minister Narendra Modi articulated his vision of strengthening the supply chains, greater regional connectivity and people-oriented development policies. Many observers in the media express concern over China's growing influence, but India has pointed out that it enjoys centuries-old ties with all the Central Asian countries. Once again, Bharatiya Janata Party is observing a fortnight-long Seva Pakhwara to observe the birthday of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The programs took off on Saturday, the PM's birthday, and the highlight now is on encouraging blood donation countrywide. This was envisaged following the need for big reserves in our blood banks during the COVID pandemic. Other highlights include events of public welfare and resolving pending complaints. Meanwhile, the first batch of cheetahs landed in the country on the very same day to be relocated at Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Indian and Chinese troops completed the mutually agreed disengagement process at hot springs in eastern Ladakh this week. The almost 6-day disengagement process included stopping forward deployments, dismantling all temporary structures and restoring landforms to pre-standoff positions. The process was duly verified at each stage and our commanders ensured a calm, incident-free disengagement. The Gyanvapi case is maintainable and therefore will be heard by the competent court as the Places of Worship Act does not apply in this case. This was ruled by the Apex Court in its verdict on a petition by women devotees demanding permission for daily puja of Ma Shringar Gauri. These women had gone to Supreme Court as the Anjuman Intizamiya Mosque Committee had challenged their petition for puja. One fiasco after another followed Congress leader Rahul Gandhi's Bharat Jodo Yatra all of this week. More than two-thirds of their legislators, including former CM Digambar Kamath, quit the party midweek and merged with BJP in Goa. Netizens on social media quipped that this had become Congress Chodo Yatra. Meanwhile, opposition parties, especially the CPM, slammed the yatra by questioning Rahul Gandhi's intentions to take on the BJP and RSS. Well-known Australian academic Professor Babones has substantiated through a recent research paper what New Delhi has been flagging for a long time, that there is a clear anti-India bias in a section of the Western media and their intelligentsia. To know the highlights of this research paper and what are the details of the study, who better to talk to us than Professor Salvatore Babones himself. Let's connect to the good professor right away. Here I have with me, connecting straight from Sydney, Professor Salvatore Babones, who teaches in the University of Sydney. Welcome to Media Scan, sir. It's fantastic to have you on our show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And my first question to you, sir, right away. We in New Delhi, the Indian establishment, our people, and a section of our media has been flagging for a long time now how some of the reports in the past few years of the American and other Western nations think tanks and a section of their prominent media has been trying to demean, to discredit and downgrade our democratic, our freedom credentials. But you, sir, as a non-Indian, what prompted you to undertake this study? Can you tell us?
By profession, I'm a quantitative comparative sociologist, which means I study data about large panels of countries cross-nationally. And something that really struck me about India is that India is not only the world's largest democracy. That's not a very interesting fact. Democracy is unrelated to country size. There are big democracies, small democracies, it doesn't matter. The interesting fact about India is it is by far the world's poorest, successful, well-institutionalized democracy. In fact, to find any other country that is a well-institutionalized democracy, by which I mean holding regular elections, having a vibrant free press, to have any other country with such a well-institutionalized democracy, you have to look to Eastern Europe and countries that are roughly 5 times as rich as India. So that struck me as a very interesting social scientific proposition. I wanted to know, why is Indian democracy so successful in an environment where virtually every other country has failed at running a democratic state? Yes, and so that led me to study India as a particular case of democracy. I'm working on a book. I'm in the early stages of research in a book on Indian democracy, in which I go back to its very origins, reading the sources going back to Nehru and Prasad and Ambedkar, but also taking the story forward. I want to answer this crucial question: how has India succeeded where so many other countries have failed? Not a single post-colonial state other than India has maintained its democracy from the moment of independence until today. All of them have fallen once, twice, several times out of the ranks of democracies. Only India has remained a democracy continuously for the last 70 years. And it was that, marking that point, that the 75 years of Indian democracy, that led me to write this paper, and somewhat in celebration, but also just to mark the time that this seemed a good time to take a step back and have a look at India's democracy rankings.
So, Professor, in the light of what you have just raised, about India being a robust, a vibrant democracy ever since we attained independence 7.5 decades ago, and certainly this is a great time to make an assessment since we are at the cusp of 75 years of our independence, the Amrit Kal as we call it here. However, in the light of this statement and your comments, sir, you have flagged how a section of the Western media has been trying to downgrade us as a vibrant democracy, but then you did not seem very convinced with their conclusions or their criteria. You have even complained of cherry picking on their side. Why, sir, do you think this is so? And in your study in the past few decades, why do you think this particular period has come to be noticed in a certainly biased, or if I may say, tilted manner?
Well, to be clear, I haven't studied all Western media. I focused on 3 very prominent organizations in particular. The Economist Intelligence Unit in London, the United States Freedom House think tank, and Sweden's Varieties of Democracy Institute. All of them publish democracy rankings or freedom rankings of one kind or another, and all of them have severely downgraded India over the last few years, especially since 2019, calling India only partially a free country, or calling India no longer a democracy. In fact, in the words of Varieties of Democracy Institute, now an electoral autocracy. Now, I found that very hard to believe. I wanted to see the data. I wanted to see the actual evidence marshaled. And so I went into the reports produced by all 3 of these organizations. What struck me was that the narrative support behind their rankings seemed extraordinarily weak to me. And as a quantitative analyst myself, I noticed several things that just flagged for me the kinds of things that we as statisticians can do to massage data. And so I started looking into
Professor, allow me to interrupt you for a second. I'll come to the narrative justifications in just a moment. But before that, sir, do you want to tell us what you found regarding the criteria or lack of criteria, perhaps, in the preparation of these 3 reports?
For the most part, the criteria are quite reasonable. There are things I would quibble with. For example, the Varieties of Democracy Institute considers it democratic to have a universal welfare programs instead of targeted ones, where I think in a poor country like India, it makes much more sense to have targeted programs than to have universal ones that benefit even the very rich. But that's a minor quibble. At heart, the criteria on which these organizations are ranking are, I think, very sound. The problem is not the criteria. The problem is the way they've been applied and the people by whom they have applied. Remember, when Freedom House or Economist Intelligence Unit ranks 220 countries on their levels of democracy, they don't have the resources or indeed the expertise to go and formulate a ranking for every single one of them on each of the, in some cases, 20 or 30 dimensions on which they evaluate countries. Instead, they turn to experts.
I am curious to know, sir, and a lot of people have been raising this in discussions here in the national capital and elsewhere in India, and even India watchers abroad. Is it just lack of due diligence on the part of these institutions or media houses? Or is it that they just fail to understand the intricacies of the Indian system, you know, our very diversified, very plural, very multicultural society?
It's absolutely the first, not the second. That is, I don't think that Indian democracy fails on Western criteria, but should have its own criteria. Maybe India should have its own criteria, but Indian democracy absolutely succeeds on the criteria established by the Western democracy ranking organizations themselves. This is not a matter of inappropriate criteria. I personally support the criteria. I think they're very good criteria for evaluating a democracy.
Fine.
Things like freedom of the press, political openness, true competition for elections, all of that's appropriate. The problem is that these organizations cannot themselves conduct this research for 200 plus countries. So instead they rely on the opinions of experts. They have expert panels for each country they study. And the expert panels, the experts behind the expert panels, are the people who I believe are giving India inappropriate ratings on what are really fundamentally solid criteria.
So, who do you think are the people on the expert panels who are not presenting the correct picture? They are subjective in their opinion, and that is why it gets reflected in the report, sir. And secondly, coming to what you were trying to elucidate, the issue of narrative justifications which precedes and follows such reports.
The names of the experts in the panels are not published, but they come from the expert class. People like me, these are academics, intellectuals, journalists, sometimes book authors, people who know something about the country, who've studied the country, or who have some serious expertise on the country. The problem here is that many experts, unfortunately, don't have the courage, don't have the self-restraint to evaluate a country objectively, when instead they can use the rankings as a way to express their own political opinions. Now, I don't think I'm teaching anyone in India when I say that most elite Indian intellectuals are broadly oppose the BJP, are broadly contemptuous of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. That's not me making that evaluation. That's something I see in the Indian press.
Are you saying that the section of the Indian intelligentsia is also behind the kind of reports that we have seen lately?
They are behind the reports. Now, I'm not saying that they have these views. I'm saying it's very clear to anybody that they have these views. All you have to do is read the press or watch YouTube or listen to a university lecture. Indian academics and Western academics who specifically study India experts, anthropologists on India, places like Stanford University, Harvard University, at JNU in India, at prestigious universities around the world, not uniformly, but overwhelmingly have a political viewpoint that is hostile to the current government of India. Now, that shouldn't matter. Right? All of us have political viewpoints. You presumably have a political viewpoint. The problem is when we bring our political viewpoints into what should be an objective rankings exercise.
So I shall come to the question whether these reports, these opinions, subjective or otherwise, how much do they matter? Do they matter at all? Before that, Professor, you have raised in your research paper I was reading, and you have just passingly mentioned just now that there was a clear anti-BJP stance which gets reflected into these reports and the following
Right.
narrative. Why do you think any institution or media house or any segment of the intelligentsia, the commentators, should have a position against only one particular party or a leader, if I may say so? And
First,
why do you think it's happening at such a level? Are you sure it is so?
First, I want to make absolutely clear that I have not explicitly studied the opinions of Indian intellectuals. I think I'm stating something that's a truism that, broadly speaking, everyone's aware that Indian intellectuals, especially elite Indian intellectuals at universities like Harvard and Stanford, are, broadly speaking, opposed to Narendra Modi and the BJP. Now, I'm not surprised that that would be the case, because Narendra Modi, the BJP, and for that matter, the RSS, come from a very organic Indian, local language speaking, local segment of society, whereas intellectuals tend to be English-speaking, Western-oriented, tie into networks that go beyond the country, are very internationalist. And the phenomenon of intellectuals disparaging Narendra Modi and the BJP is no different from intellectuals disparaging Donald Trump and the Republican Party in the United States, or disparaging the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison or Tony Abbott and the Liberal Party in Australia, or disparaging Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party in the UK. This phenomenon is a global phenomenon. It's not specific to India. Now, I haven't done research on this phenomenon, but I think it's very well attested.
Should I gather from your explanation that there is a section in the world, in the Western intelligentsia, which usually, acts as the opinion makers for the entire global segment, which is particularly biased or has a negative orientation towards certain political parties in countries all over various continents, and that is how they pull the narrative all over. Is that so?
Look, we have a lot of research, for example, in the United States, that university professors overwhelmingly, something like more than 90%, donate to the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party, right? So this is nothing exceptional, and that's not a problem. Everybody has their own political viewpoints and are entitled to those viewpoints. The problem is when they let their objectivity be compromised in the interest of their own petty political partisan goals. And that's what I've seen in these rankings. Going into the rankings themselves, I've seen lots of evidence of manipulated data, of cherry-picked data, of outright misrepresentation of data that has been adduced, it seems, to make the Indian democracy seem worse than it actually is.
Fine, absolutely fine, sir. But from that flows my very next question, and that is, you have written in a section of your paper that these reports and these notes and these narratives which come out ultimately manage to, create an opinion and form opinions at the multilateral level in the international fora. But there is a segment of the population here in our country, sir, who have been following these reports just like you, and they believe that there is really no need for a validation from the Western countries or any other foreign sections. They also believe that we need not bother too much about what these reports are saying about our country, so long as the government of the day or the establishment enjoys the support of the Indian people, because after all, they are going to decide the fate of the country. But you seem to believe that such reports can and actually do have an impact. Why do you think so?
Oh, these reports are very influential in shaping other countries' policies towards India. Take, for example, United States security cooperation with India. All of that depends on perceptions that India is a fellow democracy. The quadrilateral security dialogue, including India, Australia, the United States, and UK, is a common group of democracies who share common values. Now, to the extent that the global narrative shapes India as being no longer a democratic country, it would become very difficult for Western governments to work with India. Take something like sales of advanced fighter jets or advanced military technology. All of that could potentially be threatened by these kinds of perceptions.
Sir, you have yourself admitted that these reports do have a lot of influence in shaping opinion at the world level vis-a-vis India, even if it may not affect voting within the country. And that point is well taken, sir. At the same time, you also believe that there is cherry picking, objectivity is compromised, and then there is a lot of manipulation sometimes. How do you think a sovereign nation like India, a vibrant democracy like ours, can fight this manipulation, these data and reports? Because as you said, they do seem to influence opinion at some level.
I would like to see India publishing much more data and publishing it more systematically. A lot of the problem is that the access to data is very difficult. Those people who put together databases can then manipulate or massage how those data are presented through the way they present them to the press, in some cases through not making the raw data available, but only making their analyses available. I think the best way to fight these kinds of misrepresentations is by producing and making public high quality data. And I stress, even when that data may seem embarrassing. For example, it would be great to see a national database out of India of violence against journalists. Right now, we rely on activists. We're trying to make a case against Indian democracy. They're the only ones who are compiling the data on violence against journalists. Now, if the government were to compile official data on that, we would all use the official data. Similarly for UAPA prosecutions, similarly for the use of sedition charges. We would love to see a lot more data coming out of India that would support a more accurate appraisal of Indian democracy.
So are you saying, sir, that since there may be a kind of reluctance, or perhaps, the concerned institutions are not so cooperative, if India were to come out with raw data in a very open manner at a much more bigger scale, it would help clear some of the cobwebs, if I may say?
No, to be clear, it's not India that's not being cooperative. Other governments don't produce this kind of data, but other governments aren't suffering these kinds of attacks. So I'm not saying that India has been deficient in providing this data. I'm saying that if India wants to combat these misrepresentations in a systematic way, it can do so by putting the resources into making public data that otherwise is left to NGOs and critics to compile themselves.
How, if you have been following our recent news reports, sir, would you view Indian government's and particularly our Prime Minister Narendra Modi's efforts towards decolonization of the Indian mind, our education, our symbols, our memorials at every stage, our streets, the effort to help us to come out of the colonial mindset, which created a hangover for 7 decades, even after the country gained political independence?
Look, that's a matter for Indians. That's not a matter for me to give advice on. There are good arguments on both sides. Some countries make a point of remembering their colonial heritage as being part of who they are, whether it was positive or negative. Other countries try to erase that colonial heritage. It's really up to Indians the degree to which they want to shape their own identity in the future, not up to an external expert like me.
Sir, since this is Media Scan, my last question to you has to be directly on the media. And my straight question to you is, how do you view the Indian media when it comes to interpretation of these reports from the global institutions, particularly the Western ones? And what do you think would be the best way for the Indian media to present a true picture of the country, but at the same time, not fall into the trap of manipulated and subjective opinions?
I think the Indian media are very robust. I've seen articles on all sides, both critics and supporters of these international rankings. I think the important thing is to remember we can't expect ordinary journalists who have the pressures of filing a report with deadlines, we can't expect ordinary journalists to be delving into the footnotes of academic research reports. That's a job for academics to do. I think Indian reporting on the rankings has been very robust and has been very fair. I mean, there have been both supporters and critics, and I've seen a lot of very solid reporting. But what reporters do is report. Research is an academic function, and that's what's really lacking.
So very clearly, Professor, you have a nice, strong, a positive opinion of the Indian media in a general way, and that
very much so.
And that's a very encouraging view to have. But on that note, I am afraid I shall have to wrap up this very interesting conversation with you this evening, but with the promise that we shall see much more interesting points coming from your side as part of your study, your researches in the coming months, in the coming years. And do keep alive your interest about India as other parts of the world. Thank you so much for connecting with us, Professor Salvatore Babones. It was great to speak to you, sir, and really a very enlightening, eye-opening conversation. So that was Professor Salvatore Babones, who was explaining and sharing with us some of the high points of his recent research on India, on reports from the section of the Western media vis-a-vis our democracy, our freedom. But on that positive note, it's time for a wrap-up on Media Scan for this evening. See you next week. Namaskar.